Hello, students of Max 210, the history of mass communication out of the University of the Fraser Valley, and welcome to our 12th and, as it happens, final lecture in the course that we will conduct again through video interface. In lieu of the advantages of face-to-face lecture, face-to-face instruction, under the current restrictions that we're facing, and has been the case with the previous installments of the lecture videos for the course. There is an accompanying PowerPoint presentation available through a link through the same section of the weekly materials on the Blackboard LMS, where you found the link to this video. And once again, it's useful to follow along with the slides in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation. But as always, I will embed the slides, images from the slides, into this video lecture. And I will also verbally indicate when it's appropriate to advance to the next slide. So our agenda for today is we're going to conclude the course with a look at the topic of globalization, which of course builds significantly and specifically on last week's lecture on digitalization and the internet. With that period of time was sort of building up to the turn of the millennium. And this one will look at a much more present tense understanding of the situation available to us in mass communications under the conditions of the global internet. So at this point, I'll invite you to advance to or begin with the first slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation. Now, as with the lecture last week, in which I intended to begin by inquiring of the class what they understood by the term digitization, I was going to begin this class by asking what students understand by the term globalization, which, as it happens, is much more polysemic and multivalent than digitization. But in lieu of face-to-face or at least real-time interaction, I'll just offer a definition that I've taken from the textbook for actually the course available at UFV called Mass Communications in Canada. It states that specifically, globalization refers to the increased mobility of people, capital, commodities, information, and images associated with the post-industrial stage of capitalism. With the development of increasingly rapid and far-ranging communication and transportation technologies, and with people's improved, though far from universal or equitable, access to these technologies. Simply put, according to the authors of that textbook, globalization means we're more closely integrated with the rest of the world than ever before. Now, all of these elements of globalization that the authors of that textbook referred to, the movement of capital, the movement of images, information, commodities, and people, none of this is new. In fact, all of those things have gone back perhaps as far as recorded human history. But globalization then doesn't refer to these things emerging, but to their significant interactive nature under the conditions of digitization and the internet and the World Wide Web discussed last week, and their acceleration, especially in the late 20th century with the advent of digitization and the technologies to which it gave rise, like the internet, the iPhone, the World Wide Web. They have accelerated at a rate never before seen in human history. So it's not the advent or the phenomenon of the movement of people, the transportation of commodities that's new under globalization. It's the acceleration of these things to levels never before seen. If you remember our friend Marshall McLuhan, who comes up again and again in media courses, he argued that electronic media created, for the very first time in history, the possibility of instant communication between any 2 points on the globe. And he referred to this phenomenon as the global village. And while electronic communication is now happily entrenched in our daily lives, in the early 1960s, when McLuhan introduced his notion of an electronic society, it seemed rather audacious, almost, the same way that we talked last week about Berners-Lee's use of the term World Wide Web seemed audacious, although it turned out to be accurate. His introduction, McLuhan's introduction of an electronic society also seemed audacious. and even trivial to claim that somehow television, telephones, radio, and at the time telex, the technologies that were predominant, were going to be as influential as writing and print had been, especially as it's related to Gutenberg's printing press from 1454. And though McLuhan was often a cryptic prophet, difficult to interpret some of his really really divergent pathways of analysis in much of his writing. Nevertheless, his observations concerning the global village and the role of electronic media in it are now seen by many as having anticipated the most recent developments in electronic media. And this is precisely why the editors of Wired magazine made McLuhan their patron saint in many ways. At a time when satellite communication was just being developed, he foretold the rise of 24-hour cable news networks and their ability to seemingly make us eyewitnesses to history as it's made, on the battlefield or at the barricade. And at a time when he was theorizing at a time when mainframe computers actually filled entire floors of office buildings, he envisioned a future when personal computers would be everywhere and the internet would give everyone instant access to immense stores of information. But as at least one media critic, Meyerowitz, for example, noted, to be everywhere in terms of McLuhan's global village is in some ways to be nowhere, to have no sense of place whatsoever. To have access to information is not the same thing as being able to effectively select and use information. So the global village, according to Meyerowitz, isn't situated in space or time. And he quite astutely asks, I think, is it possible to adjust to living in such an amorphous, ambiguous social structure? Or will the global village merely be a facade used by cynical elites to exploit people? And these questions actually go quite far beyond the recounting of history with which this course is concerned, and certainly go beyond the paeans to electric media that can be found throughout McLuhan's seminal text entitled Understanding Media. But they do provide valuable food for thought in terms of analyzing the historical record and perhaps efforts to understand what McLuhan's intentions were in theorizing a future so audaciously and yet so accurately. Now, also of concern in terms of the context of globalization is media theorist James Carey, perhaps as significant to the historical record of media history as Marshall McLuhan. And he argued that the internet should be understood as the first instance of a global communication system, realizing McLuhan's imagining of the global village, displacing a national system that came into existence in the late 19th century with the development of initially telegraphy and railroad transportation, and later national magazines, newspapers, radio, and television. These are, of course, what we defined in the last lecture as old media, or the traditional mass communication media silos of the 20th century. Now, Carey suggests that we're actually witnessing the emergence of what he referred to as a new media ecology, which transforms the structural relations among older media, such as print and broadcasting, and integrates them into a center around the new defining technologies of computer and satellite. So at this point, it's time to proceed to the second slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation for this video lecture, our last lecture on globalization. And it might be useful at this point, actually, in terms of our discussion of globalization, to summarize our lecture from last week in terms of the emergence of the internet and the World Wide Web, and the technologies and techniques that underpinned it. And actually, it's all really quite nicely summed up in the Abate reading from this section of the textbook, Janet Abate's Popularizing the Internet, on pages 297 to 302. And I'm just going to read some sections from Abate's contribution because I think they're valuable and they're concise. The first incarnation of the web was created in 1990 by Tim Berners-Lee, Robert Kaliau, and others at CERN, which we talked about last class. The computing tradition on which Berners-Lee drew was far removed from the military route of the ARPANET and the internet. The also far removed from the hacker counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s. In 1974, Ted Nelson, a vocal champion of this counterculture, had written a manifesto called Computer Lib, in which he urged actually ordinary people to learn to use computers rather than leaving them in the hands of the computer priesthood, he called it. More to the point, Nelson had proposed a system of organizing information that he called hypertext. Now, hypertext would make it possible to link pieces of information rather than having to present information in a linear way. And all of this we discussed last week when we looked at the emergence of the internet under the conditions of digitalization. Now, Berners-Lee planned to create a hypertext system that would link files located on computers around the world, forming a World Wide Web of information. And in Berners-Lee's vision, the web would create a pool of human knowledge that would be easy to access. First, however, Berners-Lee and his colleagues had to create a shared format for hypertext documents, which they called, if you remember, the Hypertext Markup Language, the HTML. Our experience, Berners-Lee reports, is that any attempt to enforce a particular representation leads to immediate war. Format negotiation allows the web, as he called it, to distance itself from the technical and political battles of the data formats. So his group designed the Hypertext Transfer Protocol that we discussed last class, the HTTP, to guide the exchange of information between web browsers and web servers. To enable browsers and servers to locate information on the web, there also had to be some uniform way to identify the information a user wanted to access. And to address this need, as we discussed last class, he created the Uniform Resource Locator, a standard address format that specifies both the type of application protocol being used and the address of the computer that has the desired data. And, although the internet originated in the United States, from these historical records, we can see that Switzerland was involved, CERN was involved. It didn't simply spread from the U.S. to the rest of the world. Rather, its global reach resulted from the convergence, a term we looked at last class, of many streams of network development. Since the early 1970s, the ARPANET network that we discussed last week and the internet had included sites outside the United States. University College London had an ARPANET connection for research purposes, and ARPA's satellite network linked the United States with a seismic monitoring center in Norway. By the mid-1970s, state-run networks were being built in a number of countries, including Canada, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And introduced in 1982 was the Minitel system in France by their telephone company France Telecom. It was the first phone company to offer a network service that provided content as well as communications. And the Minitel allowed millions of ordinary people to access online telephone directories and other commercial and recreational services via the internet, including, as Abate notes, online pornography, which has come up in a number of our lectures as one of the money-making vehicles that underpinned the internet, a popular attraction that received much comment in France, but of course that the U.S. government, under different social conditions, could not have openly supported as an internet phenomenon at the time. Now, one of the world's leading sites for computer networking was CERN, CERN, the European Laboratory for Particle Physics, where Berners-Lee was working when he effectively invented the World Wide Web. In the early 1980s, to make it easier to transfer such data around his laboratory in Geneva, CERN installed local area networks, what we now refer to as LAN, frequently as part of the internet systems we use, for example, at universities or other corporate workspaces. And networks outside the United States had few links to the internet. Of course, while it was under military control, it wouldn't have made sense for them to. But when the National Science Foundation set up the civilian NSF Net, National Science Foundation Net, by about mid 1988, they were followed by Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden later that year, and then by Australia, Germany, Israel, Italy, Japan, Mexico, the Netherlands, and New Zealand, Puerto Rico, and the UK in 1989. And lastly, by Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Chile, Greece, India, Ireland, South Korea, Spain, and Switzerland, all in 1990. Effectively, this connected almost all of the industrial developed world through the World Wide Web. So at this point, as we continue our discussion of globalization, it's time to proceed to the third slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this video lecture. And in this, as we move into discussing James Carey's other category of satellites, which we didn't discuss much last class. They were developing in tandem, of course, with internet technology, and certainly they're also relevant to the phenomenon of globalization. In 1969, the Telesat Canada Act established the joint public sector-private sector corporation that was given the responsibility to own and operate the Canadian satellite communication system and to provide communication services to Canadian locations on a commercial basis. Telesat's first satellite was launched in 1972, and shortly thereafter, the company initiated the first domestic satellite communications service in the world. So although Telesat was not the first to launch satellites, what represented the company that was first, like I said, to initiate a domestic satellite communication service. By 1995, Telesat had launched 5 series of satellites. And with the CRTC's telecom decision called 9419, the door has opened for competition in providing satellite services, and Telesat no longer enjoys the monopoly that the Canadian government afforded it. And of course, different countries around the world also have different histories of their own satellites, but not as many countries that are connected to the web that we just discussed have launched satellites, of course. Many of them have international arrangements to use the satellites launched by countries like Canada, the US and Japan. So moving on from a brief discussion associated with slide number 3, I'll ask you now to proceed to slide number 4 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation in order for me to graphically participate in introducing the idea of Wi-Fi. So another development in interactive media is the wireless fidelity technology, what we generally refer to as Wi-Fi. And it untethers laptops and allows the internet access anywhere through radio waves. And of course, this is associated with satellites as well. Satellite distribution of radio waves is part of the way in which we're able to access the internet anywhere through our cellular service. And interestingly, it's the coffee chain Starbucks that was smart enough to make a bit of a splash with the use of Wi-Fi by making it available for free as an umbrella over their franchise locations, and encouraging customers to linger at their locations and thereby probably buy more coffee and snack products. And hotels and airports were, of course, natural for Wi-Fi. Many Canadian cities, for example, from Chilliwack, close to here, to St. John's, have free Wi-Fi hotspots in their downtown areas. Now, one justification for municipal Wi-Fi is to bridge what's been called the digital divide, the socioeconomic distinction between people who can afford internet access and those who cannot. Although really internet access is not being properly managed by governments, at least in the spirit of overcoming the digital divide, and it's become a highly privatized industry, notwithstanding Shaw's sort of free availability anywhere in an urban center. So the World Wide Web emerged as an internet application in the early 1990s under the leadership of Tim Berners-Lee, and it quickly grew to be the largest user of internet bandwidth. And so here we have the underpinning reason that many people actually confuse the internet, which is really the medium itself. It's the vehicle of information transfer, and the World Wide Web, which is the information base of all of the interconnected computers and data centers around the world. Because the World Wide Web is the dominant user of internet bandwidth, of course, the two are often used as terms interchangeably, but now I think we can understand a little bit better. The internet is the vehicle, and the World Wide Web is the phenomenon. And this phenomenon, of course, gave rise to what we now live in, the internet industry. It was seen when it was first emerging in the 1990s as a gold rush. It drew major investments when it became a vehicle for commercial traffic. And some of the emerging companies are relevant to the history of the emergence of the World Wide Web that we now experience. Early on, entrepreneurs saw the internet as a mountain of gold just waiting to be mined. Investors poured millions into a wide range of ventures beginning in the early 1990s. But most didn't get it right. Like with all the media we've looked at through history, things were not quite established. People didn't know quite what to make of the internet or how to make use of the internet, as happened with radio and television after it, even with the printing press at first, before the much later conventionalization of things like newspapers. And the financial landscape at the time in the 1990s, it was littered with failed startups and bankruptcies. And by 1999, all of these sort of disparate internet startups triggered a prolonged economic recession called the dot-com boom, or the dot-com bubble, and it was a bust. The bubble had burst. And although now there's a new stability in terms of the commercial interests governing or participating in the World Wide Web, the internet remains an industry that is not standardized as much as it should be. There's all sorts of concern over the distribution of addresses, now primarily governed by American media imperialism. As well as the issue of net neutrality is in question, as we discussed in the previous lecture. And the eventual shape of the internet and the World Wide Web that depends on it, it remains a matter of conjecture, although it is becoming significantly standardized right under our feet, even as you listen to this lecture. Now, Google was really the first company to figure out how to make massive profits from the internet. And while everyone else, all these other companies focused on creating website content that attracted readers, Google trumped them all by indexing that content. Really, Google is exactly what we understand it to be. It's a search engine. And it indexed everything, all of it, that everyone else was posting. So as a portal for finding content, Google captured millions of eyeballs every day. It wasn't the only search engine, but it was certainly simple, and its library was much larger than many of the other search engines available. And with every search, Google posted sponsored links on screen, side by side, with links to the sites having some relevance to the search. So advertisers who were eager for this really direct exposure paid Google for the sponsored links. By 2005, Google was the fastest growing company in history, with annual revenue topping $6.7 billion American each year. That's right. And other internet giant media giants, the other big three today include Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. However, Google was not the first company to make profit from the internet. It was the first company to do it with such dramatic success. But on a lesser scale, it really followed the model of the Lexis and Nexus databases, which had actually made money all the way back in the 1970s, shortly after the internet became widely available, even if only to very, very standardized military and corporate interests. And that's a reasonable segue, I think, into the topic of what I've already briefly introduced called the digital divide and American media imperialism. So even today, with the internet reaching its second quarter century as a medium for commercial traffic, the history of the shape of the industry is still in flux to some degree. And until the technology entirely plateaus, although it may have plateaued with the Apple iPhone, the rough and tumble, energetic, hopeful new enterprises, which were followed by disappointments and setbacks amid huge successes like Google. These will mark the industry, and we still continue to see an ever-changing landscape of industries and corporations and businesses attempting to make their way. Some of them with dramatic success, and some of them forgotten before they're ever known in the very tumultuous field of internet industries. And moreover, the dominance of English on the internet has led to many political disputes. Better than 90% of the material available on the World Wide Web is published in English over what is often seen as an American cultural or even linguistic imperialism, media imperialism. And the unequal distribution of wealth among nations as well will continue to shape the internet worldwide. As a medium of instantaneous communication, the internet certainly overcomes geographic distances, but it has done very little to erase political or social differences, certainly class differences. In fact, in many ways, it's actually heightened the distinctions between lower income parts of the world and higher income parts of the world, or more affluent parts of the world. Whereas in a public sphere, when you had different political opinions, the people who were financially disenfranchised were present, even if they were ignored. But the internet gives the illusion of sort of global participation. And it gives the illusion of a democratic global participation, and where those individuals or groups or nations from less financially privileged means used to be present in the conversation, if not ignored. Now they're absent from the conversation. They're simply not present on the World Wide Web, and so their voices are not only ignored, they're simply erased, giving the illusion of increased democratic participation on the World Wide Web, when in fact what it's done is simply limit the conversation to countries and individuals who are well off enough to be able to participate with the technology that makes the World Wide Web possible. So at this point, I'll invite you to proceed to the fifth and I believe final slide, perhaps, in the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this final lecture in the history of mass communication, Max 210, and lecture 12. And to conclude, I'd like to just review some of the interesting material in the last two chapters of our textbook that deal with what has come to be called Web 2.0 and the phenomenon of social media, respectively. In Alice E. Marwick's contribution to the compendium of our textbook called A Cultural History of Web 2.0, she notes that the biggest trend in recent years has actually been the rise of social networking. And the web status as a new interactive mass media following the dot-com boom and bust that we discussed around the turn of the millennium is often called Web 2.0. And this status comes to the fore when we consider the extent to which it enables consumers of media content to become producers as well. And some have termed this prosumption or producage, portmanteaus of two words of production and consumption, or production and usage. And they've celebrated this interactive phenomenon as an important step toward the democratization of communication and the erosion of corporate media power. Although those sort of utopian and ideal prognostications have largely been challenged by studies coming from the tradition of political economy. So, to unravel the complex assumptions, says Marwick, within what's called Web 2.0 ideology, it's necessary to understand its origins. And the term Web 2.0, according to Marwick, began as a marketing ploy to differentiate a new crop of tech companies from the failed .com counterparts that preceded them. Web 2.0 originated in San Francisco, and Northern California, with Silicon Valley, has a long history of generating wealth from innovative technologies, transistors, microelectronics, video games, and of course the .com companies. And this history begat what's called the California ideology, a set of widely held beliefs that increasing the adoption of computer technologies brings positive social consequences. But the technology industry, and that the technology industry is where the best and brightest in communications thrive, as well as that unfettered free market is the best way to ensure this prosperity. Something of a contradiction in that, as of course Marwick goes on to explain. Web 2.0 ideology, she says, is the child of both Silicon Valley entrepreneurial capitalism as well as active subcultures like independent publishing, anti-globalization activism, the Burning Man festivals, cyberdelic rave culture, and free and open source software. Indeed, Web 2.0 celebrated the adoption of social technologies as a precursor to a better, freer society, and framed the collection and sharing of information as the bedrock of revolution. Technologists, and pundits liberally applied the Web 2.0 label to wikis, blogs, social network sites, tagging, and other user-generated content sites like Wikipedia, MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, Flickr, Dig, and Twitter. So, while Web 2.0 situated itself in allegiance with the countercultural critique of mainstream media, it positioned itself. It positioned actually social media technology, certainly characteristic of mainstream media, rather than social protest or political participation, as the solution to the media dominance of mainstream media. Rather than rejecting capitalism, Marwick points out, Web 2.0 ideology fully embraced it under the otherwise apparently benign banner of social media. And Web 2.0 discourse finally ended up positioning the entrepreneur as the mythic hero and the venture-backed startups as the epitome of high status. And this can be viewed in sort of the hero worship that underpins the heads of companies like Facebook and Amazon as mythic media heroes in the Web 2.0 environment. Zuckerberg and can't remember the name of the head of Amazon right now, amongst others. Bill Gates, going back as far as now considered billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates. And the second article from the last two chapters of our textbook compendium, Tom Standage's Social Media Retweets History, it looks even deeper into the radical potential of Web 2.0 and the phenomenon of social media, and further exposes how this radical potential has been absorbed into corporate interests. And in doing so, interestingly enough, he likens contemporary social media forums to really old media, he refers to it, that predated the commercial silos of the 20th century. And this takes us actually nicely full circle in the course material. Standage states that in the years since the internet became widespread, it's become commonplace to draw distinctions between new media, which we discussed the terminology of new media in the last lecture, based on digital technologies, and the old media that came before it. But as he points out, old media, it's now apparent, was something of a historical anomaly. And by old media, he really means the media silos, the analog media silos, the electronic analog media silos of the 20th century. He says these began in 1833, with the launch of the New York Sun, with its innovative mass media model based on amassing a large audience and then selling their attention to advertisers. He says that if you look back before 1833, however, to the centuries before the era of the old media, to what could be termed the era of what he calls really old media, and the media environment based on distribution of information from person to person along interpersonal social networks has many similarities with the world of today's social media. In many respects, he says, 21st century internet media has more in common with 17th century pamphlets or 18th century coffee houses than with 19th century newspapers or 20th century radio and television. Nevertheless, he's careful, Standage is careful to point out that there are several differences between really old media and contemporary social media. As author and internet scholar Clay Shirky of New York University has pointed out, internet-based publishing is instead global, it's permanent, and searchable in a way that the earlier forms of really old media, such as papyrus rolls, poems, and pamphlets, of course, were not. But the historical forms of social media, Standage says, have enough in common with the modern sort in their underlying social mechanisms, the reactions they provoke, and the impact they have on society, that they can help with reassessments of social media today and the contemporary debates that it has emerged, particularly in terms of whether or not it will be a new democratic forum for political change or simply another vehicle of corporate consumerism and profits in the 1%. But as Standage points out, that in the era of really old media, particularly he's referring to the era building up to the French Revolution, what he refers to as Condorcet's time showed, unfettered publishing also makes it easier for governments to monitor public opinion and to keep tabs on dissidents. And as the aftermath of the French Revolution demonstrated, in a lawless environment, a free press can be exploited by populists, leading to more rule, more control, and more violence than less. Nevertheless, according to Standage, new media companies still resemble old-fashioned media companies such as newspapers and broadcasters in two specific ways. One, they are centralized, even though the distribution of information is carried out by users rather than the platform owners. Certainly there is a corporate structure, a centralized corporate structure that underpins such agencies as Facebook and Amazon. And two, they rely on advertising for the majority of their revenue. Really a financial model for mass media that emerged in the late 19th and 20th throughout the 20th century. In early days, Standage says it made sense for new social platforms to be as open as possible to attract a large number of users. Things like YouTube and the sharing platforms like BearShare and LimeWire we talked about last class were very, very open and free. Having done so, however, these platforms often then try to fence their users into walled gardens, as they call it, as they start trying to make money off the potential advertising attention afforded to the platforms by its users. And on that, unfortunately, somewhat anti-utopian note, I will conclude lecture number 12 on globalization and conclude the course, in fact, from my side of the video lecture screen. And I'd like to just say thanks to all of the students in the course for your great presentations, your diligent participation. It's been a rewarding and educational experience for me. to hear some of the insights provided by students on a history of mass communication that I've reviewed many times, but always find something new from students who are willing to search the internet for videos and contributions to add to everyone in the class's knowledge. And I invite you to take any of the insights you've acquired in the course into your own future explorations of media and media culture. So thanks one last time to everybody. Stay safe, and good luck with your final written submissions and with the final quiz to be held next week, of course, through the Blackboard LMS. Thank you, and take care.